In March 1985, a 54-year-old Communist Party official named Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, the most powerful position in the world's largest country. He did not want to end the Soviet Union. He wanted to save it. He believed the Soviet system had become stagnant, corrupt, and inefficient, that it was falling dangerously behind the West economically and technologically. His solution was reform. Carefully managed, controlled reform designed to make the Soviet system work better without fundamentally changing what it was. 6 years later, the Soviet Union no longer existed. Gorbachev had not planned this. He had not wanted this. The 15 republics that emerged from the wreckage of the USSR had not, for the most part, been actively seeking independence when he took power. The Cold War had not ended because the West had defeated the Soviet Union militarily or economically. It had ended because the Soviet Union had, in the most consequential political miscalculation of the 20th century, accidentally dismantled itself. This is the story of how that happened. To understand what Gorbachev did and why it went wrong, you have to understand the Soviet Union he inherited in 1985. By the mid-1980s, the USSR was a superpower in serious trouble. The economy was stagnating. The planned economy, which had produced impressive results in the 1930s through industrialization and in the post-war decades through reconstruction, had run out of steam. Productivity was falling. Technological innovation had slowed to a crawl. The Soviet consumer economy, always inferior to the West, was now visibly deteriorating. The war in Afghanistan, which had begun in 1979, was grinding on with no end in sight, draining resources and morale. The military budget consumed an extraordinary share of the Soviet economy. Estimates range from 15 to 25% of GDP, leaving little for consumer goods, housing, or investment in civilian technology. The Communist Party itself had become a gerontocracy. Gorbachev's 3 immediate predecessors had all died in office within 3 years of each other. Brezhnev in 1982, Andropov in 1984, Chernenko in 1985. The leadership was old, sick, and intellectually exhausted. The system they presided over was held together by a combination of repression, habit, and the absence of any visible alternative. Gorbachev was different. He was younger, more energetic, and genuinely convinced that the system needed to change. He had traveled in the West and seen what a modern economy looked like. He believed the Soviet Union could compete, but only if it reformed. Gorbachev's reform program had 2 central pillars. The first was Glasnost, openness. The Soviet system had survived for decades, partly through control of information. Citizens did not know the true scale of economic failure, environmental disaster, or historical crimes. Glasnost meant allowing a freer press, permitting more open discussion of problems, acknowledging failures that had previously been denied. Gorbachev believed this would generate pressure for reform and allow honest analysis of what needed to change. The second was perestroika, restructuring. This was the economic and political reform program. Decentralizing decision-making, introducing elements of market competition into the planned economy, reducing bureaucratic inefficiency, and allowing more genuine participation in governance. Both policies were genuinely radical by Soviet standards. Neither was intended to dismantle the system. Glasnost was meant to improve the system by exposing its problems to honest scrutiny, not to create a free press that would expose the fundamental illegitimacy of Communist Party rule. Perestroika was meant to make the Soviet economy more efficient, not to introduce capitalism or dismantle the structures of the planned economy. The problem was that once you loosened the controls, you could not predict what would happen. Glasnost in practice proved impossible to control. Once the Soviet press was permitted to report more freely, it began reporting things that had been suppressed for decades. The true scale of Stalin's crimes, the real history of the Gulag, the environmental catastrophe of the Oral Sea, the failure of the Afghan War, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, which Gorbachev's own Glasnost policy helped bring to light in ways that earlier Soviet governments would have suppressed, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with a system that had prioritized secrecy over safety. Each revelation was not just a piece of information. It was a challenge to the legitimacy of the system that had perpetrated or concealed these things. And as the legitimacy of the system was challenged, the question of whether it deserved to survive became impossible to avoid. In the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union, Glasnost had an even more explosive effect. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been forcibly incorporated into the USSR in 1940 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Glasnost allowed their suppressed national histories to be discussed openly. It allowed the illegality of their annexation to be acknowledged. And once acknowledged, it generated political movements demanding not reform of the Soviet Union but independence from it. Perestroika, meanwhile, was producing its own crisis. The economic reforms were partial and contradictory, enough to disrupt the old planning system without establishing a functioning market system in its place. The result was the worst of both worlds. The old economy was breaking down, and nothing was replacing it. Shortages became worse. The currency lost value. The black market grew. In 1989, Gorbachev made a decision that would prove to be the most consequential of his leadership. He introduced competitive elections to a new body, the Congress of People's Deputies. For the first time in Soviet history, citizens could vote for candidates who were not pre-selected by the Communist Party. The elections produced an extraordinary result. Several prominent Communist Party officials were defeated. Boris Yeltsin, whom Gorbachev had dismissed from a senior position in 1987, was elected to the Congress with an overwhelming majority in Moscow. Yeltsin became the focal point of opposition to Gorbachev and to the Communist Party itself. He was everything Gorbachev was not: populist, confrontational, willing to call for the complete dismantling of Communist Party power rather than its reform. In 1991, Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Republic, a republic within the Soviet Union, giving him an elected democratic mandate that Gorbachev, who had never faced a competitive national election, could not match. The events of 1989 in Eastern Europe accelerated the crisis, as one by one the communist governments of Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria felt a popular pressure, and as Gorbachev made clear that the Soviet Union would not intervene militarily to save them, as previous Soviet leaders had, the question of whether the same process could happen inside the USSR itself became unavoidable. It could, and it did. In August 1991, hardliners within the Soviet government, KGB chief, defense minister, and other senior officials launched a coup attempt against Gorbachev while he was on holiday in Crimea. They announced that Gorbachev was ill and unable to govern, and declared a state of emergency. The coup failed within 3 days. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building and rallied opposition to the coup. Military units refused to fire on civilians. The coup plotters lost their nerve and the coup collapsed. But the failure of the coup did not restore Gorbachev's authority. It destroyed what remained of it. The Communist Party, which many of the coup plotters had been acting to defend, was suspended. The legitimacy of the Soviet center had evaporated. One by one, the republics declared independence. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. The following day, the Supreme Soviet voted to dissolve the Union. The Soviet Union, which had existed for 69 years and had been the defining adversary of the Western world for 4 decades, ceased to exist, not because it had been defeated in war, not because it had collapsed economically, though it was in serious economic trouble, but because the man who had tried to reform it had set in motion a process that he could neither control nor stop. Mikhail Gorbachev spent the rest of his life insisting that the dissolution of the Soviet Union had not been inevitable, that a reformed, democratized Soviet Union could have survived, that the process had gone wrong because of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. He may have been right, he may have been wrong. The counterfactual is, by definition, impossible to prove. What is clear is that he set out to do one thing and accomplished another, that the reforms he designed to preserve the Soviet system created the conditions that ended it, that the openness he introduced to make the system more honest destroyed its legitimacy, that the political competition he permitted to make the system more legitimate produced the forces that dismantled it. He was not the last leader to discover that controlled reform is one of the most dangerous things a government can attempt. The controls have a tendency to slip, and once they slip, what comes next is very rarely what anyone planned.